Right now, somewhere on your body, there is probably a piece of jewelry, a ring, a chain around your neck, earrings you put in so automatically this morning that you don't even remember doing it. Maybe a bracelet you've worn so long, it feels strange without it. Now here's the strange part. The oldest confirmed pieces of clothing date to somewhere around 100,000 years ago at the earliest. The evidence is indirect, contested, and depends on interpreting microscopic traces and the evolutionary history of parasitic insects. The oldest confirmed pieces of jewelry are older, significantly older. In a cave in Morocco, archaeologists found perforated Nacarius shells, small marine snail shells with holes deliberately punched through them, clearly designed to be strung together and worn. Those shells date to approximately 130,000 years ago. Sites in Israel, Algeria, and across North Africa produced the same basic object, a small shell, carefully modified, clearly ornamental, clearly worn, before sewn clothing, before tailored garments, before the needle. There were people putting on jewelry in the morning. And the question that should be sitting uncomfortably in the back of your mind right now is the same one that sits in the back of every archaeologist's mind when they hold one of these shells. Why? Why would a human being living in a genuinely dangerous world, spending most of their waking hours focused on survival, take the time to find a specific kind of shell, carry it potentially hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline, carefully punch a hole through it without splitting it, thread something through that hole, and wear it around their neck? What problem does that solve? None of the obvious ones. It doesn't keep you warm, it doesn't help you hunt, it doesn't protect you from predators. In purely functional terms, wearing a shell necklace 130,000 years ago is an objectively ridiculous use of your limited time and energy. And yet they did it anyway, consistently, repeatedly, across thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years, which means it wasn't random and it wasn't decoration in the empty modern sense of that word. It was solving a problem, just not a physical one. To understand what problem, you have to understand something about the world those shells were being worn in. And it requires letting go of the version of ancient humans deeply embedded in popular imagination. The version where they were basically just us with worse hygiene and no internet, stumbling through survival with only the barest flicker of inner life. That version is wrong, and the shells are part of the proof. Perforated shell worn as an ornament is not a complicated object. It takes maybe a few minutes to make once you know how, but the decision to make it represents something cognitively enormous. Someone looked at a small snail shell and saw not what it was, but what it could become. They imagined it transformed, hung, worn, seen. They performed a mental simulation of a future state that didn't yet exist and then executed deliberate steps to bring that state into reality. That is symbolic thinking. And it is one of the most significant cognitive developments in the entire history of our species. Symbolic thinking is what allows you to take a physical object and load it with meaning that has nothing to do with its physical properties. A shell is calcium carbonate. It came off a snail. But once a human decides it means something, it becomes a symbol. And symbols are the building blocks of everything that makes human civilization possible. Language is symbols. Writing is symbols. Money is symbols. Religion is symbols. The entire constructed architecture of human culture rests on the ability to agree that a thing means more than what it physically is. The earliest evidence we have for that cognitive capacity is not cave paintings, it's not tools, it's not burial rituals, it's a small shell with a hole in it worn around someone's neck 130,000 years ago. Jewelry didn't come after symbolic thinking developed. Jewelry is how we know symbolic thinking developed. The ornament is the evidence, but that still leaves the original question unanswered. What problem was the shell necklace actually solving? Think about the world those early humans were living in. Small mobile bands, roughly 20 to 50 people traveling together, but not always in isolation. Groups encountered other groups. Territories overlapped. Strangers appeared. And a stranger in that world represented a genuine decision point with real consequences. Is this person from a friendly group an allied one, a dangerous one? In a world without writing, without records, without formal institutions, how do you communicate that information across the gap between two people? A shell from a specific coastline signals connections to people from that place. A particular way of stringing ornaments, a specific type of bead shared by a group, becomes a visual marker of membership. Not a flag exactly, but functioning the same way. I am one of these people. We are the group that wears this. Anthropologists call this a coalitional signal, a visible marker of group identity that allows rapid, low-cost assessment of social affiliation in situations where getting it wrong is genuinely dangerous. And here's the detail that makes this concrete. The shells used for jewelry were often not local. At sites in Morocco and Algeria and Israel, archaeologists find the same types of shells appearing hundreds of kilometers from where those shells would naturally be found. Someone carried them or traded them across significant distances, which means these shells weren't just ornaments, they were circulating through exchange networks, connecting groups across vast geographic areas. Jewelry as social infrastructure, 130,000 years ago. But there's a layer beneath the group signaling that goes deeper, because membership only partially explains the ornament. It doesn't explain the care with which these objects were made, the distances they traveled, the way they appear consistently associated with individuals. A shell worn around a neck is also a statement about a self. Not just which group you belong to, but who you are within that group. What you find beautiful, what you have acquired, what you want others to notice about you when they look. Personal ornamentation is the earliest physical evidence we have of humans experiencing and expressing individual identity. Not just group membership, but the specific, irreducible, this is me and not you quality of being a distinct person in a world full of other distinct people. And that matters because the moment you start expressing individual identity through objects, you are doing something no other animal does in any comparable way. You are constructing a self, deliberately assembling a version of yourself from materials in the world and presenting that assembled version to others as a representation of who you are. You do it constantly. Your clothes, your haircut, the objects you display, the things you post and don't post. All of it is a continuous act of self-construction, a running answer to the question, who am I and how do I want to be seen? Ancient humans were doing this with shells. You're doing it with everything. The cognitive process is identical. Now here's the part that most people gloss over, because there's something about the gap between jewelry and clothing that is actually quite strange when you look at it directly. If clothing came after jewelry by potentially tens of thousands of years, what does that tell us about what the human brain prioritized? The standard narrative assumes a neat progression from practical to symbolic. First, you solve the survival problems: food, shelter, warmth. Then once the basics are covered, you develop art, decoration, expression, all the things that require safety and cognitive surplus. But the jewelry timeline breaks that narrative completely. These shells appear before confirmed clothing. They appear in populations still deeply enmeshed in survival challenges. People for whom a bad hunting season could be catastrophic. People for whom a minor infected wound could be fatal. And they were still making jewelry, which means the need to communicate identity, to mark group membership, to construct and express a self was not a luxury that came after survival was secured. It was treated as essential, prioritized alongside food and shelter as something without which human social life could not properly function. And from an evolutionary standpoint, that makes complete sense. Humans are not solitary creatures. We never were. Our survival has always been collective. Collective survival requires social cohesion. Social cohesion requires trust. Trust requires legible identity. Legible identity requires signals. Jewelry solved that problem before clothing was invented to solve the warmth problem. Because for a social species, knowing who you're with may be just as urgent as staying warm. There's one more thing worth sitting with, because these shells aren't just evidence of symbolic thinking and social signaling. They're evidence of something softer and harder to quantify. Aesthetic experience, the experience of finding something beautiful. Someone picked up that Nassarius shell not because it was the most efficient material for an identity marker. There were probably easier materials nearby. They picked it up because something about its shape or its surface struck them as worth having, worth carrying, worth wearing. The jewelry came first, everything else came after, and maybe that tells you something about what was always most important.